It suggested that even with the wisdom of hindsight, I had at best a 50% chance of predicting the past with accuracy. Or I could have noted Daniel Kahneman's take on expert predictions, that the honest answer is nobody has a clue. So with those reservations, let me share with you some thoughts about the future. Africa is going to occupy, it will still occupy 2/3 of the Security Council's time. It has for some years. It's where most of the great humanitarian crises of the past 2 decades have occurred: Rwanda, the DRC, Somalia, Darfur. And where right now one of the greatest regional threats is unfolding in the Sahel, and even more so in Mali. There is a moral imperative to stop that misery. For example, the 2 decades-long neglect of failed Somalia has been a scandal, an international scandal. But the greatest hope for Africa comes from the recent efforts of Africa itself, through the African Union, through ECOWAS and the like. But much of the global focus is still going to be on the Middle East, because that's where what happens has significant global implications. What happens in North Africa has significant regional implications, at least for the moment, although if Nigeria is destabilized, that will be another story. But what happens in the Middle East almost automatically has global implications. And that, of course, brings us to the Arab Spring. Democratic transition won't be easy, it won't be quick, there will be instability, but it must be achieved. Anything less only ensures more unrest. There are a lot of questions. What will happen in Libya and Egypt? What if extremism prevails in Egypt, Syria or Yemen? What is the flow-on effect to the monarchies of Morocco and Jordan? And what does all of this mean for Israel? Does it face adverse changes in countries that have helped to secure its peace for the past 34 years? Can Gulf state cooperation maintain stability in that region? How much longer can President al-Assad hold on until his regime finally collapses? Will he cross the red line and use chemical weapons? Is Russian recognition of the Syrian reality too late now to broker a deal with the Syrian National Council? And what happens when al-Assad finally does go? Can any new regime hold it all together? Or will Syria revert to the type of sectarian chaos that preceded al-Assad's seizure of power in 1970? Will it break up into sectarian enclaves, as many believe? Without the US to promote stability on the ground and with growing Iranian influence, what are the prospects for Iraq? Big question. How close is Iran to a deliverable nuclear weapon? And if it crosses that red line, how will others respond? Away from the Middle East, there are other issues that demand our attention. Just as German determination appears to be addressing the Eurozone crisis, Washington, D.C. kicks the fiscal can down the road. I apologise for the mixed metaphor. It's not of my making, nor is the problem. What about the Korean Peninsula, particularly the North's recent long-range rocket launch? How many breaches of Security Council resolutions will be tolerated before it actually does something? Can an anti-Taliban government survive in Afghanistan? And what are the flow-on implications to Pakistan? And what of the Indo-Pakistani standoff? What if that escalates? Or likewise of Asia's maritime border disputes? It's little wonder, you know, that the Oxford Dictionary's 2012 word of the year was omnishambles. A situation that's shambolic from every possible angle. But I've got to tell you, there are also some positive trends. In the 10 years to 2010, 6 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies were in sub-Saharan Africa, which is why we see much more investment going into that part of the world. Now, the picture, I've got to tell you, is uneven, and whether the trend continues will depend largely on Africa's own efforts to contain instability and sectarian conflict, and whether its growing middle class can demand more effective and accountable government. But Africa's young, increasingly educated population, its vast mineral wealth and its improved policy settings and governance makes it a continent of truly great prospects. And New Zealand and its Pacific and Asian neighbours have watched with pleasure the post-conflict transitions in Timor-Leste and in the Solomon Islands. We even hope that Fiji will move back to democracy in 2012. But all transitions are potentially fragile and each carries its own risks. Any one of those issues could demand our full-time attention. Collectively, they could put the world truly to the test, possibly as we haven't been tested since the end of the Cold War. And if we are put to that test, much of our response will depend on how well we actually understand what's going on. We now know, for example, that we didn't fully appreciate the implications of the Soviet collapse, the end of the Cold War, and the flow-on effects, often far beyond obvious theatres, the breakup of Yugoslavia and diminished support for parts of Africa. The Rwandan genocide and the Srebrenica massacre and other atrocities all occurred in a post-Cold War context, when some regimes and blocs were struggling for legitimacy, and indeed when some states and blocs were actually disintegrating. The international community celebrated what it saw as the end of history. But only when the machetes came out in Rwanda and hillside towns burned in Srebrenica did we focus on the consequences of the political, the economic, the social and the cultural declines that came at the end of the Cold War. If, as some believe, these things come round in 20 to 25-year cycles, it would be far better if next time we really do understand what's happening, why it's happening and what it means. We need to learn and apply the lessons of history. When asked what would be most likely to blow governments off course, Harold Macmillan, British Prime Minister of the late 1950s and early 1960s, replied, "Events, dear boy, events." The events of August and September 2008, that's Lehman Brothers and all that, caught governments and regulators by surprise, but at least they responded quickly. The fall of the Berlin Wall was equally a surprise, but in that case it took all the months and the years that followed to understand what it really meant and how we should respond. The Arab Spring is upon us. Syria slides further out of control. There's still untested leadership in North Korea, all beyond our control. Events, dear boy, events. We mightn't face a repeat of the 1930s or the late 1980s, but we do and must learn the lessons of those times and be ready to respond. Michael Green and Stephen Schrage of the Centre for Strategic and International Studies have written that, and I quote, "It's no mere coincidence that the last great global economic downturn was followed by the most destructive war in human history." And that, I've got to suggest, brings us back to that reality I spoke of earlier, that smaller, advanced economies have generally made better policy choices, particularly by engaging with, rather than by resisting, the global forces that sometimes spook much larger countries. Small countries, you know, don't spend time arguing about the merits of tax cuts versus expenditure cuts. Their industries and banks aren't too big to fail, and they can't respond to global pressures with autarkic protectionism, with subsidies or with tariffs. Green and Schrage also highlighted the challenges to the democratic model, the sort of situation that we face right now in the Middle East. They said that to thrive, new democracies must deliver basic economic growth. Think Egypt on that. Reversal of the democratic expansion of the last 2 decades would not only impact the global balance of power, but also increase the potential number of failed states with all the attendant risks they bring, from harbouring terrorists, Mali, to incubating pandemic diseases and trafficking in persons. And they identified the risks of protectionism, with domestic demands similar to those that prompted the notorious Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1932, which many see as the key reason for war finally spreading to Asia and the Pacific in December 1941. The lessons of history, indeed. The United Nations resulted from the lessons of history. The most destructive war in human history, the greatest ever global depression, massive human rights violations, and the failure of the League of Nations to prevent all that happening. The result was the United Nations. whose primary purpose was, as Douglas MacArthur said at the surrender ceremony on the battleship Missouri, so elegantly and so simply, that peace now be restored to the world. Now, some people would define that peace simply as the absence of war, but real peace is much more than that. It's accompanied by an unavoidable set of values, including freedom from tyranny and freedom from fear. And I'd add to that secure access to safe food and water, freedom from poverty, freedom from preventable disease, the freedom to learn, and the freedom to choose one's own leaders. That's real peace. And that peace challenge still confronts us, made all the more acute and made all the more pressing and all the more urgent by Middle East issues, the Arab Spring, economic concerns and events in Africa, North Korea, Afghanistan, Pakistan and elsewhere. You know, we often encounter skepticism about the readiness, the willingness and the ability of the United Nations to deal with such issues. But those skeptics should be reminded that the UN was created to meet challenges that were in the past so overwhelming that many people could only find solutions in either autarkic economic responses or in war and destruction. And that dealing with those issues by better, more peaceful means was never going to be easy. I had to think about all this when, for a class speech, a 9-year-old asked me what was the best thing about being appointed as New Zealand's ambassador to the UN. I told her that the UN's purpose was to ensure peace for everyone. It hasn't been perfect, I said, but it's done a lot of good. And it's meant that unlike my father's and grandfather's generation, I and others like me never had to fight in a global war. Now, it isn't the UN alone that's delivered that period of global peace.